What my truck hit at 80 miles per hour on Interstate 94 wasn't an animal I could explain. It was a dogman 7 feet tall, walking upright, with amber eyes that reflected my headlights, like it was deciding whether to let me pass. When I got out to check what I'd hit, I found claw marks gouged into the asphalt and a blood trail leading into the forest. I followed it and found the creature's body. Massive, intelligent, impossible. Then the black SUVs arrived. Federal agents in tactical gear, moving like they'd done this 100 times before. They had a pre-written statement ready for me to sign. They cleaned the road, removed the body, and made it all disappear in under 20 minutes. Because that dogman wasn't alone in those woods, and the cover-up didn't start with me. So before we continue, make sure you subscribe and let us know where you're watching from. Thanks. I run a dedicated route between Minneapolis and Green Bay, hauling automotive parts for one of the big manufacturers. It's steady work, decent pay, and the schedule is predictable enough that I can plan my life around it. 3 runs a week, same route, same truck stops, same stretches of highway that I know better than my own neighborhood. The night it happened was a Thursday. I'd left the distribution center in Minneapolis around midnight with a full load of transmission assemblies headed for a plant in Green Bay. Weather reports called for clear skies and temperatures in the low 20s. Perfect conditions for a night haul. My truck was a 2017 Freightliner Cascadia with just over 400,000 miles on it. Reliable machine, never gave me trouble. Maintained by the book every time. The first few hours were routine. I grabbed coffee at the truck stop in Menomonee, checked my load securing straps, and got back on I-94 heading east. Traffic was light, mostly other commercial drivers making their overnight runs. The CB radio was quiet except for the occasional weather update and trucker small talk. I was making good time, running about 15 minutes ahead of schedule. Around 2:15 a.m., I was approaching a stretch of highway about 40 miles west of Eau Claire. This section runs through dense forest on both sides, with the road cutting through what used to be unbroken wilderness. During the day, you might see the occasional deer, or even a black bear if you're lucky. At night, it's just trees and darkness pressing in from both sides. That's when my headlights caught something on the shoulder of the road. At first, I thought it was a person, maybe someone with car trouble or a hitchhiker desperate enough to be out in sub-freezing temperatures. But as I got closer, my brain started registering details that didn't fit. The figure was too tall, easily 7 feet, maybe more. It was standing on 2 legs, but the proportions were all wrong. The arms hung too low, almost to the knees, and it was covered in dark fur or hair that seemed to catch the light from my headlights in a way that made my stomach tighten. I was doing 80 miles per hour, the speed limit for commercial vehicles on that stretch. In trucking, you learn not to make sudden moves. Jerking the wheel or slamming on the brakes with 40 tons behind you is a recipe for disaster. But every instinct I had was screaming at me to do something, anything, to avoid getting closer to whatever that thing was. The creature, and I use that word because nothing else fits, turned its head toward my truck. That's when I saw its eyes. They caught my headlights and reflected back, like a dog's eyes do, but the color was wrong. Not the yellow-green you see in deer, or the red you might get from a raccoon. These were amber, almost orange, and they had an intelligence to them that made my blood run cold. What happened next took maybe 3 seconds, but I can replay it in slow motion in my mind, like it's happening right now. The creature stepped onto the highway. Not stumbled, not lurched, but took a deliberate step into the lane I was traveling in. It raised one arm, almost like it was trying to signal me to stop, and that's when I got my first clear look at its hand. 5 fingers, or close enough, but with claws that caught the light. The face wasn't human, wasn't ape, wasn't anything I could identify. It had a long snout, almost canine, but the head shape was wrong for a dog or wolf. I didn't have time to swerve. At 80 miles per hour, you cover about 117 feet per second. The creature was maybe 200 feet ahead when I first saw it, which gave me less than 2 seconds to react. I hit the brakes, felt the ABS system kick in, heard the air brakes hiss, but I knew it wasn't enough. The impact, when it came, wasn't as violent as I expected. There was a solid thud, not the sickening crunch you get from hitting a deer, and the whole cab shuddered. But my truck, all 80,000 pounds of it, barely slowed down. Whatever I'd hit went under the front bumper, and I assume under the wheels. I managed to bring the truck to a stop about a quarter mile down the road. My hands were shaking so hard, I could barely work the parking brake. I sat there for maybe a minute, trying to process what had just happened. Every part of my training said I should call 911, report the accident, check for damage to my truck. But another part of me, the part that had seen those eyes, wanted to put the truck in gear and just keep driving until I was somewhere with lights and people and things that made sense. I grabbed my flashlight and my phone and climbed down from the cab. The highway was empty in both directions, just miles of darkness broken only by my truck's running lights. It was cold enough that my breath came out in clouds, and the silence was absolute. No traffic, no wind, nothing. I walked back along the shoulder, my flashlight beam sweeping back and forth across the asphalt. I was looking for blood, for fur, for some evidence of what I'd hit. What I found was worse than nothing. About 100 feet behind my truck, there were marks on the road. Not tire marks, not the kind of skid you'd expect from an impact. These were gouges in the asphalt, like something with claws had tried to grip the road surface. And there was blood, but not much. A few drops here and there, almost black in the flashlight beam. But no body, no debris, nothing that looked like the aftermath of hitting a 7-foot creature at highway speed. I kept walking back, following the blood trail. It led off the road and into the tree line on the north side of the highway. I'm not an idiot. Every horror movie I've ever seen, every true crime podcast I've listened to, they all start with someone following something into the woods in the middle of the night. But I needed to know. I needed to see what I'd hit, to confirm it was real and not some hallucination brought on by too much coffee and too little sleep. The trail was easy to follow at first. Blood drops on the snow that had collected under the trees, broken branches, disturbed leaves. I pushed maybe 50 feet into the forest, my flashlight cutting through the darkness, when I found it. The creature was lying on its side in a small clearing, partially hidden behind a fallen log. It wasn't moving. I approached slowly, every muscle in my body tensed to run if it so much as twitched. Up close, it was even more disturbing than it had been in my headlights. The body was massive, easily 7.5 feet long from head to toe. The fur was dark brown, almost black, and thick enough that I could barely see the skin underneath. The face was a nightmare mix of canine and primate features. The snout was elongated like a wolf's, but the eyes were set forward like a human's or an ape's. The mouth was partly open, and I could see teeth that were designed for tearing meat, long canines that looked more like something from a prehistoric predator than anything living today. But it was the hands that really got to me. They were almost human in structure, 5 fingers with opposable thumbs, but covered in fur, and tipped with claws that were easily 2 inches long. The creature was wearing no clothing, had no collar or tags, nothing that suggested it was anything other than a wild animal. Except wild animals don't stand upright and try to flag down trucks on the highway. I stood there staring at it for what felt like an hour, but was probably only a minute or two. My mind was trying to categorize what I was seeing, to fit it into some framework that made sense. A bear that had been trained to walk upright. Some kind of elaborate costume? A genetic experiment that had escaped from a lab? None of those explanations fit what I was looking at. That's when I heard the vehicles. Not on the highway, but coming through the forest behind me. I could see lights flickering through the trees, multiple vehicles moving fast over rough terrain. My first thought was relief. Someone else had seen the accident, had called for help. But something about the way those lights were moving, the purposeful way they were approaching, made me uneasy. I quickly made my way back to the highway, emerged from the tree line just as 3 black SUVs pulled up behind my truck. They weren't marked, no police lights, no government logos, just dark vehicles with tinted windows. 6 men got out, all wearing dark tactical gear that looked more military than law enforcement. They moved with the kind of precision that comes from training and experience. One of them approached me, a tall guy in his 40s with short gray hair and the kind of face that doesn't show much emotion. He asked if I was the driver of the truck, if I'd reported an accident. I told him I'd hit something on the highway, that I was about to call 911. He nodded like this was expected and asked me to show him where the impact had occurred. We walked back to where the gouge marks were on the road. I pointed out the blood trail leading into the woods. The man, who never gave me his name, told me to stay by my truck while they investigated. He spoke into a radio on his shoulder, using codes I didn't recognize, and the other 5 men disappeared into the tree line with heavy-duty flashlights and what looked like equipment bags. I waited by my truck for what must have been 20 minutes. The cold was starting to seep through my jacket, and my mind was racing with questions I didn't have answers to. Who were these people? How had they arrived so fast? Why did they seem to know what they were looking for? Finally, the gray-haired man returned. He told me they'd found what I'd hit, a large black bear that had wandered onto the highway. I started to argue, to tell him what I'd actually seen, but something in his expression made me stop. This wasn't a request for information. This was him telling me what the official story was going to be. He asked for my license and registration, took photos of my truck with a professional-looking camera, and had me sign a statement saying I'd accidentally struck a bear on Interstate 94. The statement was already typed up on a tablet he was carrying, like he'd prepared it before even talking to me. I asked who he worked for, what agency he was with. He showed me credentials that identified him as a federal wildlife officer, but the badge looked wrong, the agency name too vague. After I signed the statement, he told me I was free to go. My truck had minimal damage, a few scratches on the front bumper and grille, nothing that would prevent me from completing my delivery. He suggested I not discuss the incident with anyone, mentioned something about protecting endangered species and ongoing federal investigations. Then he and his team were gone, disappearing back into the forest, taking whatever they'd found with them. I sat in my cab for a long time after they left, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Every part of the encounter felt staged, rehearsed, like these people had done this before. The way they arrived so quickly, the pre-written statement, the vague credentials, all of it pointed to an operation that was designed to contain and control information about something specific. I finished my delivery to Green Bay on schedule, handed over my load, did my inspection, and tried to act like it was just another normal run. But nothing about that night was normal, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd stumbled into something much bigger than a simple wildlife encounter. When I got back to Minneapolis, I tried to research what I'd seen. I spent hours online looking at cryptozoology websites, reading reports of DOGMAN sightings in Wisconsin and Michigan. What I found was disturbing. There were dozens of reports, going back decades, of similar creatures in the forests of the upper Midwest. Most were dismissed as hoaxes or misidentifications, but some of the descriptions matched what I'd seen with eerie accuracy. Large bipedal canines, intelligent eyes, behavior that seemed more calculated than animalistic. Some reports mentioned government involvement, claims of cover-ups, and intimidation of witnesses. I reached out to a few of the other witnesses whose stories I found online, using throwaway email accounts and being careful not to leave a digital trail. 3 of them responded. All of them had similar experiences. They'd seen something that shouldn't exist, had reported it, and then had been visited by people in dark suits or tactical gear who convinced them to change their stories. One woman in northern Michigan told me she'd been threatened with federal charges if she continued to discuss her encounter publicly. The more I dug, the more I realized there was a pattern. Sightings were most common in remote areas, forests far from major population centers. But almost all of them were quickly discredited or explained away. And in cases where physical evidence existed, that evidence had a way of disappearing or being seized by authorities who claimed jurisdiction under various federal statutes. I tried to go back to the site of my encounter a few weeks later. I wanted to see if there was anything I'd missed, any evidence that might prove what I'd seen was real. But when I got to that stretch of I-94, I found the entire area had been cleaned. The gouge marks in the asphalt had been filled and repaired. The section of forest where I'd found the creature had been cleared, all the vegetation removed in a radius of about 100 feet. It looked like a professional cleanup operation, thorough and complete. That's when I knew for certain that what had happened wasn't just some strange wildlife encounter. Someone, some organization with serious resources and authority, was actively working to suppress information about these creatures. They had the capability to respond to incidents within minutes, to alter physical evidence, and to intimidate witnesses into silence. The question was why? What was so important about keeping these things secret that they go to such lengths to cover them up? I started noticing things after that night. Sometimes when I was on long hauls through remote areas, I'd see vehicles that seemed to be monitoring the highways. Dark SUVs parked at rest areas or on service roads, always with their occupants watching, always positioned where they'd have a clear view of the road. I couldn't prove they were watching for the same creatures I'd encountered, but the coincidence was hard to ignore. My route took me through northern Wisconsin regularly, and I started paying more attention to the forests on either side of the highway. A few times, usually around dusk or just before dawn, I thought I caught glimpses of movement in the trees, large shapes that moved in ways that didn't match any known wildlife. I never stopped to investigate. The memory of those amber eyes and the expression on that creature's face as I hit, it was enough to keep me moving. I also became more aware of gaps in the official record. There were stretches of highway in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Minnesota where accidents were reported but never fully documented. Missing reports, incomplete investigations, witnesses who suddenly refused to talk about what they'd seen. It was like there was a systematic effort to erase certain types of incidents from the public record. I tried talking to other truckers about what I'd seen, testing the waters with vague questions about strange encounters on the road. Most dismissed me immediately, wrote it off as exhaustion or imagination. But a few, the ones who'd been driving long enough to have their own stories, they listened differently. They didn't laugh or make jokes. They just nodded, and sometimes, if they trusted me enough, they'd share their own experiences. The first real conversation I had about it was with an older driver named Bill at a truck stop outside of Milwaukee. He'd been hauling freight for 35 years, had seen just about everything the road could throw at you. When I carefully broached the subject of unusual wildlife encounters, he went quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup like he was weighing whether to trust me with something important. Finally, he told me about an encounter he'd had in the 1990s on a back road in northern Minnesota. He'd been running a load late at night when something ran alongside his truck for nearly a mile. Not behind it, not in front of it, but keeping pace with him at 60 miles per hour through dense forest where no animal should have been able to maintain that speed. He said it was massive, running on two legs, and every time he tried to get a better look at it, it would drop back into the tree line just far enough to stay in shadow. When he finally accelerated to try to outrun it, the thing let out a howl that he said sounded like nothing he'd ever heard before or since, part wolf and part something else, something that made his skin crawl even all these years later. Bill told me he'd reported it to his dispatcher the next morning, said he'd seen something strange alongside the highway. Within a few hours, he'd received a call from someone claiming to be from the Forest Service. They'd asked him detailed questions about the encounter, where exactly it had happened, what time, whether he'd stopped or taken photos. At the end of the call, they'd thanked him for the report and mentioned that there had been some escaped animals from a research facility in the area, and they were working to recapture them. He never heard anything more about it, never saw any news reports about escaped animals, never got any follow-up. But the message was clear. He'd seen something he shouldn't have, and it was being handled. What struck me about Bill's story was how similar it was to mine. The quick response from authorities, the vague explanation that didn't really explain anything, the sense that there was a system in place specifically to handle these kinds of reports. It wasn't just random chance. It was organized, methodical, like there was a playbook for dealing with witnesses who'd encountered these creatures. Over the following months, I collected more stories, not just from truckers, but from hunters, hikers, park rangers, anyone who spent significant time in the remote areas where these encounters seemed to happen. A bow hunter in Michigan told me about tracking a deer through the woods and coming across what he initially thought was another hunter in a ghillie suit. But when he called out, the figure stood up to its full height, easily 8 feet tall, and crashed off through the brush, moving faster than anything that size should have been able to move. He'd packed up his gear and left the woods immediately, and when he tried to report it to the DNR, he was told they'd had several false sightings in that area, and he'd probably seen a bear standing on its hind legs. A park ranger in Wisconsin shared his experience of finding tracks one winter morning that didn't match any known animal. They were canine in shape, but nearly twice the size of the largest wolf print he'd ever seen, and they showed evidence of bipedal locomotion. The stride pattern was wrong for a 4-legged animal. He'd taken photos and measurements, followed the tracks for over a mile until they disappeared into a rocky area. When he tried to file an official report, his supervisor had pulled him aside and suggested that the tracks were probably just distorted wolf prints. Melted and refrozen snow can create misleading impressions. The photos he'd taken mysteriously disappeared from the ranger station files a week later. These weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a pattern that stretched across the entire upper Midwest and probably beyond. Credible witnesses having encounters with creatures that shouldn't exist, trying to report what they'd seen, and then being subtly or not so subtly discouraged from pursuing the matter further. And in almost every case, there was some official explanation offered that was just plausible enough to make the witness doubt their own perceptions. What bothered me most was the efficiency of it. These responses weren't ad hoc or improvised. They were professional, practiced, like the people handling them had done it dozens or hundreds of times before. That suggested an organization with resources and reach that went far beyond what you'd expect from managing rare wildlife encounters. It suggested something much bigger, a coordinated effort to keep certain information out of the public consciousness. I started digging into the history of cryptid sightings in the region, looking for patterns that might reveal more about what was going on. What I found was fascinating and disturbing in equal measure. Reports of dogman-like creatures in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Minnesota went back over a century. Native American tribes had legends about creatures that matched the description, shapeshifters or spirit animals that walked the boundary between human and wolf. Early European settlers had reported encounters with wolfmen or werewolves, though those accounts were usually dismissed as folklore or superstition. But the modern sightings, the ones from the past 50 or 60 years, those had a different quality to them. They were more detailed, more consistent, and they came from witnesses who had no cultural or historical reason to believe in such creatures. Highway patrol officers, biologists, experienced outdoorsmen, people whose professional credibility depended on accurate observations and clear thinking. They were seeing something real, something that existed in the physical world, not just in legend or imagination. And the more recent the sightings, the more likely they were to involve some kind of official response or follow-up. Witnesses from the 1970s and 80s mostly just filed reports that went nowhere if they reported their encounters at all. But starting in the 1990s and accelerating into the 2000s, there was a noticeable increase in cases where witnesses were contacted by authorities, where evidence was confiscated or disappeared, where official explanations were offered that contradicted what the witnesses had seen. That timeline coincided with something else I discovered in my research. In the early 1990s, the federal government had established several biological research stations in remote areas of the upper Midwest. They were officially studying wolf populations, monitoring reintroduction programs, tracking migration patterns. But the facilities were larger than you'd expect for simple wildlife monitoring. They had security fences, restricted access, and budgets that seemed disproportionate to the stated mission. I tried to find out more about these facilities, but information was scarce. The research papers they published were technical and unrevealing, focused on routine population data and habitat studies. There were no visitor programs, no public outreach, no educational tours. For government research facilities, they were remarkably closed off from outside scrutiny. And when I tried to find them on satellite imagery, several of the facilities I'd found references to either didn't appear at all or were obscured by image artifacts that suggested the photos had been deliberately degraded. The more I learned, the more convinced I became that what had happened to me wasn't an isolated incident or a simple cover-up of an embarrassing animal control failure. It was part of a long-term, well-funded program to study and contain knowledge about species that weren't supposed to exist. The creatures were real. The research facilities studying them were real. And the system for managing public encounters with them was very, very real. I spent hours late at night, between runs, piecing together what I'd learned. The government, or some subset of it, knew about these creatures. They'd been documenting them, studying them, probably for decades. And they'd developed sophisticated methods for ensuring that knowledge didn't spread beyond the small circle of people who were cleared to know about it. Witnesses were managed, evidence was controlled, and the official narrative was carefully maintained to exclude the possibility that anything truly anomalous was happening in America's forests. But why? That was the question I kept coming back to. Why go to such lengths to keep these creatures secret? Was it to prevent panic? To protect the creatures from being hunted or exploited? Or was there something else? Something about the existence of these animals that challenged assumptions the government wasn't willing to let be challenged? I considered several possibilities. Maybe the creatures were more intelligent than any non-human animal we'd previously documented, and acknowledging their existence would raise uncomfortable questions about consciousness and rights. Maybe they were remnants of species we thought were extinct, which would overturn accepted paleontology and evolutionary biology. Or maybe their existence was somehow connected to classified research, genetic experiments, or breeding programs that had produced these hybrids between canines and primates. None of those explanations felt quite right. They all had holes, inconsistencies with what I'd observed. The creature I'd hit hadn't looked like any kind of hybrid or experimental animal. It had looked like something that had evolved naturally, a species that had found its niche in the ecosystem and adapted to survive in it. The intelligence I'd seen in its eyes wasn't the clever opportunism of a trained animal or the confusion of something created in a lab. It was the awareness of something that belonged in its environment and understood the risks of entering mine. What scared me most was the thought that there might be a lot more of these creatures than anyone realized. If they were smart enough to avoid most human contact, to stay in the deep forests and only occasionally cross into our territory, then population estimates based on sightings would be drastically low. There could be hundreds or even thousands of them living in the remote areas of the upper Midwest, maintaining their own communities, following their own behavioral patterns, existing in parallel to human society without most of us ever knowing they were there. And if that was true, if there was a whole hidden population of intelligent cryptids living alongside us, then the implications were staggering. It meant that our understanding of North American ecology was incomplete in fundamental ways. It meant that wilderness areas weren't as empty as we thought they were, that there were apex predators we hadn't accounted for, species that could potentially pose risks to humans venturing into their territories. And it meant that the government had been lying to us about the true nature of the natural world for generations. One driver, a guy named Marcus, who ran routes through Upper Peninsula, Michigan, told me about the time he'd had to swerve to avoid hitting something that ran across Highway 2 near the Wisconsin border. He described it as looking like a wolf the size of a man, running on two legs. He'd reported it to his dispatcher, and within an hour, he'd received a call from someone claiming to be from the Department of Natural Resources. They'd told him he'd probably seen a bear and suggested he not file an official report because it might affect his commercial driver's license. When he'd insisted on making a report anyway, his truck had been impounded for a surprise dot inspection that found violations so minor they shouldn't have been actionable. He got the message. Marcus and I became something like allies in trying to understand what we'd experienced. He'd been driving for about 18 years when his encounter happened, had a spotless safety record, and had never been one for tall tales or exaggeration. But his experience had shaken him enough that he'd actually considered leaving the profession. What bothered him most wasn't the creature itself, terrifying as it was. It was the response from the authorities, the way they'd known exactly how to pressure him into silence, the implications that his career and his livelihood could be threatened if he pushed too hard for answers. We met up a few times at truck stops along routes we both ran, trading information and trying to make sense of what we'd learned. Marcus had done his own research and had discovered some things that added to the picture. He'd found old newspaper articles from the 1960s and 70s that described unusual animal attacks in rural areas of the upper Midwest. Livestock mutilated in ways that didn't match known predators. Hikers found dead with injuries that couldn't be explained by bears or wolves. Small towns where residents reported hearing strange howls at night that grew so frequent and disturbing that some families moved away. In almost all these cases, the official explanations were either bears or wild dogs. But the details never quite fit those explanations. Bears don't typically hunt in packs. Wild dogs don't leave tracks that suggest bipedal movement. And neither species tends to target prey in ways that show sophisticated planning and coordination. The incidents all had elements that pointed to something else, something that displayed intelligence and behavior patterns that didn't match any documented North American species. What was most revealing about these old articles was what happened afterward. In the weeks following the initial reports, there would usually be follow-up stories about how investigators had determined the attacks were indeed caused by known animals, often with quotes from wildlife experts who'd examined the evidence. But when Marcus tried to track down those experts or find the original evidence reports, he hit dead ends. The experts either couldn't be located or refused to discuss the cases. The evidence had been lost or destroyed. The files had been sealed or transferred to federal custody. It was the same pattern over and over again. Something anomalous would happen, would generate local attention and concern, and then would be systematically explained away and buried in the official record. And the people doing the explaining and the burying had resources and authority that went well beyond local law enforcement or state wildlife agencies. They were federal, or possibly something even more obscure, operating with the kind of carte blanche that suggested they were protecting something considered a matter of national security. Marcus had also found something else that disturbed both of us. In several instances where there had been credible sightings of these creatures, there had been military training exercises conducted in those areas within weeks or months of the sightings. Not National Guard exercises, but Special Forces training, units that specialized in operations in difficult terrain and unconventional warfare scenarios. The official explanations for these exercises were always routine, maintaining readiness, training in diverse environments. But the timing and locations were too coincidental to dismiss. Were these units being trained to handle encounters with the creatures? Were they practicing containment and extraction procedures? Or were the creatures themselves connected to military research in some way? Perhaps the descendants of biological warfare experiments or genetic research programs that had gone on longer and deeper than anyone wanted to admit. We couldn't prove any of it, but the circumstantial evidence was compelling enough to make us both uncomfortable with how deep this conspiracy might go. I also started noticing changes in my own life after that night on I-94. Nothing overt, nothing I could point to definitively, but small things that made me wonder if I was being watched or monitored in some way. My truck would sometimes need maintenance that wasn't reflected in my service logs. Computer files on my laptop would show access times when I knew I hadn't been using it. My cell phone battery would drain faster than it should, even when I wasn't actively using it, which is a classic sign of background monitoring software. I couldn't prove any surveillance was actually happening. All of it could have been coincidence, the normal wear and tear of equipment, my own paranoia making patterns out of random events. But I couldn't shake the feeling that my encounter had put me on some kind of list, that people were keeping track of me to make sure I didn't become a problem, didn't start making too much noise about what I'd seen. I became more careful about what I said and where I said it. I stopped discussing the incident over the phone or in emails. When I met with Marcus or other witnesses, we'd choose locations randomly, change plans at the last minute, take basic precautions that probably seemed excessive but gave us some sense of security. We started using encrypted messaging apps, sharing documents through secure file transfers, treating our investigation like it was actually as sensitive as we suspected it was. The deeper we dug, the more we realized how widespread this phenomenon was. It wasn't just the upper Midwest. Similar reports came from the Pacific Northwest, the Appalachian Mountains, the Northern Rockies, anywhere there were large expanses of wilderness and low human population density. The creatures varied somewhat by region, different descriptions of size and coloring and behavior, but the core elements were consistent. Large bipedal canines, intelligent behavior, encounters that were quickly suppressed or explained away by authorities. And everywhere these encounters happened, there were signs of the same coordinated response system. Witnesses contacted and pressured into silence. Evidence confiscated or disappeared. Official explanations that didn't quite match the facts, but were close enough to create plausible deniability. It was national in scope, probably had been operating for decades, and had the kind of funding and authority that suggested it was considered a critical government function. Marcus and I started cataloging everything we found, building a database of encounters and responses, looking for patterns that might reveal more about what was being hidden and why. We documented the locations of sightings, the timelines of official responses, the people who'd been contacted afterward. We tracked the movement of those mysterious federal vehicles through remote areas, noting when and where they appeared. We collected every scrap of evidence we could find, from blurry photos to second-hand accounts to official documents that had been leaked or obtained through FOIA requests. What emerged from all this data was a picture of a program that had been in operation since at least the 1960s, possibly earlier. The government, or a specific agency within it, had been aware of these creatures for generations. They'd been studying them, tracking their populations, managing public knowledge about them with increasing sophistication as technology and media evolved. And they'd been doing it all in complete secrecy, with a level of compartmentalization that meant even most government officials probably didn't know the program existed. The question remained, why keep it secret? Why not just acknowledge that there were unknown species in North American forests and treat them like any other wildlife conservation issue? The only answer that made sense to us was that there was something about these creatures that couldn't be publicly acknowledged without creating problems that government wasn't willing to deal with. Maybe they were more intelligent than the public could accept. Maybe their existence would undermine too many established scientific theories. Or maybe their origins were connected to something classified, something that would expose other secrets the government wanted to keep hidden. Whatever the reason, The secrecy was maintained with ruthless efficiency. And witnesses like Marcus and me, who'd seen too much and knew too much, were left in a strange limbo. We couldn't prove what we'd experienced to anyone who hadn't had similar encounters. We couldn't force the government to acknowledge what they were hiding. And we had to live with the knowledge that reality was fundamentally different from what most people believed, while being unable to convince anyone else of that truth. Another driver, a woman named Sarah, who hauled refrigerated goods through northern Minnesota, told me about finding a carcass on the side of Highway 53. It had been torn apart, not eaten by scavengers, but systematically dismantled, like something had been looking for specific organs. She'd called the local sheriff, and they'd sent someone out. But before the deputy arrived, a crew in unmarked white vans had shown up and removed the carcass. When the deputy finally got there was nothing to see. The crew had even cleaned the blood off the road. These stories, and dozens more like them, painted a picture of something operating just outside the boundaries of normal life. There were creatures in the forests of the upper Midwest that didn't fit into any zoological classification. And there was an organization, government, or military, or something else entirely, that was dedicated to keeping those creatures hidden from the public. The question I couldn't answer was whether they were protecting the creatures from us, or protecting us from knowledge of the creatures. I've thought a lot about that night on I-94 over the past 6 years. I've gone over every detail in my mind, questioned my own perceptions, considered the possibility that I'd misidentified what I'd seen. But I keep coming back to those eyes, to the intelligence I saw in them, to the deliberate way the creature had stepped onto the highway. It wasn't trying to cross the road. It was trying to stop my truck. And when I hit it, when I felt that impact and saw it go under my wheels, I knew I'd killed something that had been thinking, had been making choices. The thing that haunts me most isn't the creature itself. It's the cover-up, the speed and efficiency with which those men arrived and erased all evidence of what had happened. The pre-written statement that reduced an encounter with the impossible to a simple traffic accident. The implicit threat behind their suggestion that I not discuss what I'd seen. It all pointed to a system that had been in place for a long time, a system designed to keep certain truths from becoming public knowledge. I've become more careful about the jobs I take and the routes I drive. I avoid the deepest forests when I can, stick to well-lit highways, and make sure I'm never the only vehicle on a stretch of road. I keep my phone charged and my CB radio tuned to emergency channels. And I've started carrying something I never thought I'd need, a dash cam that records everything in front of my truck in high definition. If I ever encounter one of these creatures again, I want proof that can't be confiscated or dismissed. Sometimes I wonder how many other drivers have had similar experiences. How many have seen things that shouldn't exist and been convinced to stay silent about them. The trucking community is tight-knit, but we're also practical. Most drivers aren't going to risk their careers and their reputations by talking about cryptids and government conspiracies. But late at night, when you're alone on a dark highway with nothing but your thoughts and the endless white line in front of you, those practical considerations start to seem less important. I've tried to move on with my life, to treat that night as an anomaly and focus on the job I've been doing for over 2 decades. But it's changed me in ways I'm still trying to understand. I'm more alert now, more aware of my surroundings. I notice things I used to drive right past, patterns in the forest that might indicate something moving parallel to the highway, gaps in the tree line that could provide cover for something watching the road. And I've become something of an amateur researcher, collecting stories and reports from other drivers and witnesses. I have files full of accounts that will never be officially documented, encounters that happened but were never recorded. Some of them are probably misidentifications or hoaxes, but others, the ones with consistent details and credible witnesses, those are harder to dismiss. What I've learned is that there's a whole hidden ecosystem of creatures that exist in the spaces between what we know and what we're allowed to know. The DOGMAN, if that's what it was, is just one species in what appears to be a much larger population of cryptids that inhabit the remote forests of North America. And there's an equally hidden infrastructure dedicated to keeping those creatures secret, to managing encounters, and to ensuring that witnesses either stay silent or are discredited. I don't know who's in charge of this operation. I don't know if it's a military black budget program, a civilian agency operating under classified authority, or something else entirely. What I do know is that they're effective. They have resources, they have expertise, and they have the legal backing to operate with impunity. When they show up at an incident, local law enforcement defers to them. Regular citizens comply with their instructions, and the official record is adjusted to eliminate any trace of what actually happened. The night I killed that creature on I-94 changed my understanding of the world. I used to think that the maps were complete, that we'd cataloged all the major species, that the wilderness had been thoroughly explored and documented. Now I know that's not true. There are things living in those forests that science doesn't recognize, and the government doesn't want us to know about. And every time I drive through remote areas late at night, I'm reminded that we share this planet with species that exist in the shadows, just out of sight of the human world we've built. I still make my runs between Minneapolis and Green Bay 3 times a week. I still pass through that stretch of I-94 where it happened. And every time I do, I slow down just a little, keep my eyes on the tree line, and wonder if there are others out there. Others, like the creature I hit, watching the highway, trying to understand the vehicles that tear through their territory at impossible speeds. Sometimes I think about what would have happened if I'd been able to stop in time, if the creature had survived the impact. Would it have attacked me? Would it have tried to communicate? Or would it have simply disappeared back into the forest? Another near miss between the human world and whatever else is living in those deep woods? I'll never know. What I do know is that I took a life that night, something that was more than just an animal, but less than human, something that exists in a category we don't have words for. The official record says I hit a bear. My insurance company processed the claim without question. My employer never asked for additional details. As far as the world is concerned, nothing unusual happened on Interstate 94 on that November night in 2018. But I know different. I know what I saw, what I hit, and what was taken away in the back of those dark SUVs. And I know that somewhere out there, probably in a facility that doesn't exist on any map, there are people who study these creatures, who document their behaviors and their biology, who maintain a database of encounters that the rest of us will never be allowed to see. I've thought about going public with my story many times. Writing it down, posting it online, contacting journalists or researchers who specialize in cryptozoology. But every time I consider it, I remember those men in tactical gear, the pre-written statement, the implicit threat behind their professional courtesy. I remember the driver whose truck was impounded, the woman whose carcass evidence disappeared. And I remember that I have a job I need to keep, a career I've spent 2 decades building. So instead, I tell my story to people I trust, one at a time, in conversations that don't leave a digital trail. I add to my collection of accounts from other witnesses, building a record that may never be officially recognized, but exists nonetheless. And I keep driving, keep watching the forests, and keep wondering what other secrets are being kept from us. The world is bigger and stranger than most people imagine. The highways we drive on every day pass through territories that aren't fully under human control, where things that shouldn't exist, according to modern zoology, make their homes and occasionally, inevitably, cross paths with us. When those encounters happen, there's a system in place to manage them, to erase them from the record, and to ensure that the larger public never has to grapple with the unsettling truth that we don't know everything about the world we live in. I killed something on Interstate 94 6 years ago. Something that looked at me with intelligent eyes as it stepped deliberately onto the highway. Something that left marks on the asphalt that had to be professionally removed. Something that required a federal response team to clean up and cover up. I don't know what it was called. Don't know if it had a name or a classification in whatever secret files the government maintains. I just know it was real. It's gone. And the official story is a lie. That's the truth I carry with me every time I climb into my truck and head out onto the highway. And it's the truth I share now, not because I expect anyone to believe me, but because I believe that people deserve to know what's really out there, beyond the reach of our headlights, and outside the boundaries of the world we think we understand. The road goes on, the miles accumulate, and somewhere in the deep forests of the upper Midwest, things that science doesn't recognize continue to exist, watching the highways and occasionally, fatally, stepping out of the shadows. I'm still driving, still hauling freight across the same routes I've traveled for years. But I'm not the same driver I was before that November night. I'm someone who knows that the impossible is possible, that the official explanations aren't always true, and that sometimes the things you hit on a dark highway aren't just deer or bears or other mundane creatures. Sometimes there's something else entirely, something that forces you to question everything you thought you knew about the natural world. And sometimes, late at night, when the highway is empty and the forest presses in close on both sides, I catch myself looking for those amber eyes in my peripheral vision, half expecting to see another one of those creatures emerge from the tree line. I don't want another encounter. The first one was enough to last a lifetime. But I'm prepared now, aware now, watching for signs of things that officially don't exist. That's my story. The night I hit a dogman on Interstate 94 and watched as the government made it disappear. Believe it or don't. Share it or keep it to yourself. But if you're ever driving through remote areas late at night and you see something standing by the side of the road that doesn't quite look right, something too tall or moving in ways that don't match any animal you recognize, remember what I've told you. And whatever you do, don't stop to investigate. Just keep driving, call it in if you can, and hope that whatever system is in place to handle these encounters arrives before you have to face the impossible alone. The highways of America stretch through wilderness that isn't as empty as we like to believe. There are things living in those forests that we weren't meant to encounter, and there are people whose job it is to make sure those encounters leave no trace. I've seen both sides of that equation now. I've been the witness and the silenced. And I'm still here, still driving, still carrying the knowledge of what I saw and what was done to hide it. Every mile I drive is a reminder that the world has secrets we're not allowed to know. Every dark stretch of forest I pass is a potential hiding place for creatures that exist outside our taxonomies and beyond our control. And every time my headlights sweep across the road ahead, I'm reminded of that moment when I saw those amber eyes looking back at me, intelligent and aware, in the seconds before impact. I killed something that shouldn't exist according to everything we're taught about the natural world. And the most disturbing part isn't that the creature existed. It's that there's an entire system in place to ensure that people like me, who've seen the truth, can never prove it to anyone else. The evidence disappears, the witnesses are silenced, and the official record is sanitized to protect a secret that someone somewhere has decided is too dangerous for the public to know. That's the real story behind the headline that will never be written. Dogman hit by semi at 80 miles per hour. Highway accident turned into a cover-up. It's my story, and it's the story of countless other people who've encountered the impossible and found themselves up against forces more powerful than they could have imagined. We're out here, the witnesses to things that don't officially exist. And we're telling our stories to anyone who will listen, not because we expect to change the official narrative, but because the truth deserves to be told, even if it will never be officially acknowledged. The road continues, the miles accumulate, and the secrets remain hidden in the forests that line our highways. But I know what's out there now. I've seen it, hit it, and watched it disappear into the official silence that follows encounters with the unknown. And I'll keep driving, keep watching, and keep remembering the night when the impossible became real and the truth became something that had to be covered up at any cost.